Welcome back, everyone. Michael, are you there? Aha,
Hi, how are you, Brian?
I'm doing fine, thanks. How about you?
Good, good.
Well, if you're ready, I'll just tee you up with a little introduction and you can take it away. Everybody, I'd like to introduce you to Michael Swinarski, who is the Deputy CISO at CorVel Corporation. He describes himself as a collaborative and innovative leader. His experience, this is useful to us, in guiding IT security strategy, program governance, and team development. He's driven to build cooperative cybersecurity cultures through business alignment, partnerships, and knowledge sharing. He's always interested in finding unique solutions through positive debate and discussion. And he says he may have a bit too much to talk about after being in quarantine for nearly 2 years, which makes me think you've come to the right place. We're ready to hear you. Thanks a lot, Michael. It's all yours.
Outstanding. Thank you, Brian. Information security and risk management teams have struggled for years to better identify, assist, manage risks that are associated with the introduction of vendors into business processes. And many of us have witnessed a push in the last half or dozen so years as organizations respond to that business need, as well as regulatory pressures to better manage these risks. Now, today, we're going to look at ways to better understand vendor cyber risk, and we ask the question, have you zapped your vendor today? So I'm Michael Swinarski, like Brian said, and I'm very excited to come and talk with you today a little bit about third-party risk. My goal is to encourage security practitioners, such as all of you, to seek out new ways to assess vendors and their software development and cloud practices. And we'll begin with looking at a specific point in fairly recent history. Target was not the first company to be attacked by a bad actor that used their own vendor against them in order to gain access. And unfortunately, because of the overall size and scope of that particular event, Target kind of became the poster child of why vendor risk management was so important. And businesses were already trying to figure out ways to come up with how to not become the next target, pun intended. But the regulators also began to step forward, and they were adding third-party risk management to requirements in new legislation. One of the most famous is probably New York DFS 500. This is some rather prescriptive law that had a fairly lengthy list of information security requirements that had to be met in order for financial services companies to continue to do business in the state of New York. High on that list were requirements for a third-party risk management program to be included. Now, after that law took effect in March of 2017, the verbiage from that law became known as the model law, and other states started passing very similar legislation. And as a result, we had legal teams and auditors that became very, very focused on making sure that we could demonstrate that we were compliant to all the things in that long list of requirements. So companies had to find a way to demonstrate how they identify and manage risk of their vendors, and they had to do it at scale. And so as a result, most shops have a tendency to adopt a very similar risk assessment process. It's kind of a race to create a risk assessment process that can be automated fairly easily. And many programs include these attributes. Now, most programs will start by collecting audit reports such as SOC 1s and SOC 2s, maybe certifications from HITRUST or ISO, whatever report that a vendor can provide, where some third-party auditor took a look at their program and created a deliverable. That was combined with some sort of questionnaire that the vendor would be asked to fill out and return back to the business. And the business would take in all of these artifacts, review and assess, and sometimes they would find things that were of interest, and they would list them as findings or observations that would go into some sort of report, and they would give that to their business with some effort to monitor the vendor and their ability and their process to improve whatever that they may have seen. Now, this has been going on for a while now. And so this is probably a really good time to kind of start asking the question, have we gotten any better? It's been about 9 years since the Target breach, and yet we still have some fairly recent notable cases that suggest we have a lot of work to do. And some of these recent vendor events had some very significant impacts on their customers. And I'm just going to say, for the record, I don't know who the guy is in the picture, but I'm pretty certain that he's not thrilled to have his prescription data leaked online by a vendor. So I also want to include open source and third-party libraries into this discussion. All of that code that is out there has become a very critical piece of the supply chain and has gotten a lot of attention recently. And the federal government has been encouraging the open source community to find vulnerabilities and fix them faster than ever before. And that's a goal that I suspect we can all support. But what happens when those updates don't get applied? Veracode recently reported that nearly 80% of the time, third-party libraries that are being added to Codebase are not getting updated, despite the fact that the vast majority of those library flaws are actually fixed in some update at some point. And when your vendor doesn't apply updates, what is the potential impact to your business? And I know the keynote mentioned OpenSSF this morning. This is an organization that's really gotten very deep into this conversation, and they have some good information and some ideas. But I think what was also suggested is that execution is going to be quite the challenge, and it's something that we're all going to have to work together on. So what kind of challenges do we see? Now, let's start with the overall cost and reward. Now, to clarify, I'm not talking about the cost that accounts payable writes checks to cover. This is really about the time and effort that's involved for both the vendor and the business. The vendors spend a considerable amount of time with third-party audits, and these involve auditors coming into their shops, collecting all sorts of evidence, such as change records, event logs, reports, screenshots, whatever they can collect to determine if the controls that you have in place are being followed and if they're doing any good. They then issue some kind of report or certification that the vendor can then share to provide some assurance. But pulling all of that information together takes time and effort. And the control owners, well, when they're spending that time working with auditors, they're not running the business. They're not fixing issues. They're not increasing capabilities. The same could be said for all of those questionnaires. They can vary anywhere from 10 questions to well over 1,000. Sometimes those questionnaires will actually cross over and were actually answered by what was written in the third-party audits. And unfortunately, because there's not a lot of consistency in all of those questionnaires that are being passed around, it's very hard to reuse a lot of that work. In the end, the rewards for the business doing all of this work has a real questionable ROI. In the end, we end up with a lot of questions. How will the findings be remediated? How do you hold that vendor accountable to make sure they're going to do it? Can you, as your business, can you somehow figure out ways to mitigate it? Do you have the right support language in your contract with that relationship in order to hold them accountable? And can your business ever really walk away? Oftentimes, that's much easier said than done. And don't get me wrong, most shops like talking about their security program, and they should. If they should be proud of what they have to what they've accomplished. And most of them want to provide some degree of assurance that their customer is looking for. And the customer wants nothing more than to trust that vendor. I have often said that information security is a team sport, and we need to build strong, productive partnerships to collaboratively push back on the adversaries. Allies are beneficial. A few years ago, I was actually pulled into a conversation, primarily amongst some lawyers, between a vendor and a business. And there seemed to be some sticking points on adding in language that would give the business right to audit into the contract. The vendor was resistant. They didn't like the language. And finally, when we started bringing in the information security people together to talk this through, the business basically said, hey, all we really want is for you to fill out a survey every year. Vendor was totally fine with that. And the problem is because while we all know these terms, we have a tendency to use them somewhat interchangeably. And I can't help but to wonder if that's a mistake. Surely we all know the textbook definitions, but it appears that not everyone connects the differences in activities or the level of effort to support those definitions, especially those that are outside of the security profession. That seems to lead to these gaps in expectations of both the vendor and the business. And it doesn't sound like a good way to form a productive partnership. So when we did our annual update of our risk management policies this year, we also started a risk management standard where we not only tried to level set on what the definitions of these words were, and to be transparent, we simply used the language that came from ISACA. But we also tried to give specific guidance on the activities and the level of effort required when we say these things. So for example, an assessment is far less formal. An audit is very formal and very much more time consuming as we collect all of that evidence. And so we have these challenges, these issues, these gaps in our shared understanding and expectations. And so we begin to create gaps. And we have to start asking questions about, are we really reducing risk? Or are we having what is sometimes the same old argument about security versus compliance? Now, I'm not saying that the vendors are lying to you on those questionnaires, but there are studies that suggest the longer the survey, the less critical thinking the respondent uses to answer those questions. And so we have to ask, is the information we're getting accurate? Because this is probably not a good time to eliminate critical thinking. Not to mention, there's simply a chance that the respondent of the questionnaire simply interprets the question differently than the author intended. So how do we know if we found the right things? What if there's something that's missed because you didn't know the right question to ask or how to ask it. And then recently, in the last few years, we've actually become pretty embedded in asking about the controls of the vendor in order to avoid or respond to ransomware. We've had a lot of practice at it. But recently, the FBI and CISO have made it very clear that business email compromise is very much on the rise. Do we know what questions to ask the vendor on how they're protecting themselves from that? And what about the next trend? One of the things that I really am very concerned about, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this subject here at an OWASP conference, was that when I read the SOC reports, when I read the questions and questionnaires as well as the answers, I don't really feel like I get a very deep understanding around their cloud and software development practices. About a year ago, I was talking to a vendor and I was congratulating them on the fact that they had a great SOC 2 report that demonstrated that they had excellent controls in place to manage their internal systems. But when I asked when they would start testing their controls related to managing their cloud subscriptions, they seemed somewhat confused. They did very kindly offer to provide me the SOC 2 from AWS. Unfortunately, I've already seen that report. It's not really what I'm interested and not what I'm asking about. What I had not yet seen was their half of the shared responsibility model. And there's a huge need for that understanding. And so recently, I've been thinking a lot about the fact that we need to try something new techniques. And so we started with a list of some basic principles before we start looking for new solutions. We want it to be low cost. And again, I'm talking about that cost of the resource. I'm not interested in overburdening the vendor with more work, and nor do I want more work for myself. Something that's going to be quick, easy, and still add value. We want to update existing deliverables. We don't want to create new deliverables. There was mention earlier about let's stop creating PDFs. I have to agree with that. And wherever possible, let's use the existing tools that we already have readily at hand. Because we're still in kind of a proof of concept phase, I don't want to go out and buy new tools and have a parade of vendors coming through my shop. We're not ready for that yet. In the end, the overall goal is really to trust, but to verify that controls are in place and they have good processes and procedures. And so we came up with this list and we started looking for those opportunities. And it just so happens earlier this year, we had an opportunity come to our attention. And I want to share that a little bit with you. However, I will just state that everything in this narrative is based on actual events. We actually did all of these things, but I have changed the name of the vendor. I have also changed the scope of the business, but all of the premises are the same. I'm not looking to drag anybody through the mud or point fingers. That's not the point. So we're going to talk about a vendor that I refer to as Swift Data LLC. Now, they provide data about risk levels and market trends in the insurance industry on the cost to support insurance participants. The way the relationship works is we actually share with them personally identifiable and sensitive data that they then use with their data analytics to come up with more information based on comparing industry trends on what it's going to cost for us, the insurer, to properly support them. And this isn't about removing the participants who are too expensive. Rather, it's to make sure that we're budgeting appropriately and we're compliant to regulatory laws that say that we are ready to support them. The data is actually exchanged through a login website that the vendor has developed. And I've already collected the artifacts that they provided. And they have some very common and apparently effective infrastructure controls around the way they store the data, the way the data flows, encryption at transit, at rest. And they had some really great success in applying their access control as well. But again, I'm left wondering about the details of their SDLC and their secure code practices, their vulnerability management, and their third-party libraries. Where is that information? And so I went hunting and just basically surfing the web, looking for anything that happened to be out there. Do they have some trust center where there might be some other audit reports that I haven't seen? Have they outlined and published details about their SDLC and their secure coding practices? Maybe they have some sort of affiliation with an organization like OWASP or someone else that would help give us some indication. If you're looking for an example of this, I will point to another vendor that we don't really use, but I did find a lot of this sort of stuff published for Oracle. They've actually done a pretty good job, and they've set the bar really high on making this information available to folks. Kept looking, didn't really find much until eventually I did actually trip over their responsible disclosure program. They did publish that information, and it was pretty boilerplate for the most part. They had the basic rules of engagement, the goals of what they were looking for, trying to explain that, we don't want you to DDoS us or leak our data all over the place. But if you find something, please report it using an email address that's been encrypted with PGP. Fair enough. Like I said, it was very boilerplate, very, very typical sort of approach. And so this kind of gave us an idea. Let's try something. Let's do something new. We wanted to, first of all, create a plan where we agreed that we were going to follow all of those prescribed rules. And also, too, we want to keep it short. We don't want to spend a bunch of time working on this. And so we agreed this is not a pen test. We're going to find vulnerabilities. We're not going to attempt to exploit them. That takes a lot of time. We want to use whatever tools we already have. And we're going to actually report only one finding, and we're going to do so as an independent researcher. We didn't want to be moved to the head of the line if they knew it was a customer that was reporting the vulnerability. And we said only one finding, even if we found a dozen. We only want to report one because, to be honest, I don't want to become their vulnerability management program. I'm assessing their response. I'm assessing whether or not they have a vulnerability program that they themselves are doing. And I want, in the end, to add whatever we learn into our existing report and not have to create more. And so we started the first phase, and like I said, we wanted to go out and find the vulnerabilities, and we wanted to use tools that we had readily at hand. And it just so happens that right on my lab machine to my right is OWASP ZAP'ed. Now, for anyone that is not familiar with this product, I encourage you to go check it out. OWASP ZAP'ed is an open source web application and security scanner. It's intended to be used by both new application security professionals, as well as professional penetration testers. It's one of OWASP flagship products that is probably one of the most active. And so we started up the tool. We did not really do anything particularly advanced. We started an automated scan. We put in the URL. We chose to use the traditional spider, and we pressed the go button, and we let it run. The run was actually completed in less than 10 minutes, and we found 8 alerts. Now, like I said, I only want to deal with one report. And if you'll recall, this particular activity occurred in February of this year. And so there may have been a little bit of extra sensitivity around the second item in that list, the vulnerable JS libraries. And so when we drill down on that, it's a medium vulnerability, and it's the result of an out-of-date jQuery library. There's 2 CVEs associated with them. Both of them were cross-site scripting, different ways to exploit them. But they were both patched back in April of 2020, which means this vulnerability has been fixed for 2 years. That raises a lot of questions. And so we decided this is a great time to disclose what we found. And this was going to be the one that we used. So we created a third-party email address, and we went to import the public key that was posted to use for these reports into our email client, and we immediately ran into a bit of a problem. The client wouldn't take the key because the key had just expired. I'm going to assume positive intent. It was February. The key expired in January. Good possibility it was just an accident, an oversight. You know, people come back from the holidays, trying to get started on a new year. It's easy for something like this to be overlooked. So we decided we're going to use that new email address, and we're going to reach out and let them know. And so we sent the emails from the new address and just said, hey, what's up? The PGP key that you have posted on your website appears to have expired. Would you like to update, or would you prefer that I send information without the PGP? Now, we specifically chose this language because we were looking to solicit a response. We made them aware of a problem. We offered an alternative. We suggested that we have information to share, and we ended the email with a question. Now, we deliberately sent this on a Sunday, and so we didn't expect an immediate response. We figured, probably Monday, maybe Tuesday, we would hear something back. Unfortunately, that wasn't really the case. And we waited a full week and never heard back. And so the following Sunday, we thought we would try one more time. And so we replied to the original email and explained, hey, we haven't heard from you. And you haven't yet updated your key. So I'm going to share a little bit of information for you, but only the high level details, unless you tell me that you're comfortable with having this information in your email system. And I specifically stated, it appears your login website continues to use Java libraries that are out of date and contain cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. Are you aware of this? Have you mitigated? Would you like additional information? So again, I'm deliberately trying to solicit a response with the language, letting them know there's a problem, giving them a little more detail about the information I have to share, and barraging them with questions. These same questions are exactly what I want to know for our assessment. So certainly we should hear from this email. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Another week went by, we heard nothing in response. And so at the end of the second week, we could not wait any longer. The business needed to have their information. And so we went ahead on that Friday and we filed a report. Now that report had already started, so it was a matter of only adding in the new things that we learned. And so now we have three findings. We have concerns about their vulnerability and their third-party library management. We have concerns about whether or not their secure coding is effective in their development lifecycle. And it's pretty clear that they're probably not getting a lot of value from that responsible disclosure program. And we wrote that report, we shared that with the business, and we exported it, and we specifically asked the business, please share this with the vendor. It doesn't do any good if the vendor's not aware. Now, we also had some other conversations. We made some other recommendations that I'm not going to get into, but it's important to remember there was no other findings. This was the only area where we actually had something to report that said, hey, there's something going on. And so this little experiment of ours kind of came to a conclusion. And so there were some things that we felt like we learned. We learned that we do think that there is some value in this effort and adding this to an assessment that didn't take a lot of time and energy. Now, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution, right? I would not recommend doing this to all of your vendors. And specifically, I'm going to say that I don't recommend you don't do this without some sort of permission or there's a stated responsible disclosure program. I'm going to ask that you please consider that to be my disclaimer. Don't go around nuking all of your vendors and telling them that I told you so. One of the things that we also talked about is that the communication time that we awaited, well, that wasn't really use of man hours. It was a delay to the report to the business. And we need to make sure that we factor in that communication time into our plan. But it also didn't need to go on for 2 weeks. We could have probably closed that out much, much sooner. And the approach probably at some point as we mature this process a little more could use some automation. We would love to see the alerts being imported directly into our GRC tool. That's something that's probably much further down the road. And it just so happens because it was early in the year, we had our own auditors in-house evaluating our program. And one of the things they wanted to see were examples of how we're doing third-party risk management. And they got to see the report and they looked it over and they had some really positive feedback. They liked the fact that we had done this. And to be honest, I kind of suspect that they were just happy to see something different. But that last bullet point was the one I underlined because it's the one I'm really most excited about. This is really an opportunity to bring together third-party risk management with the application security and development teams, right? All too often, I see silos forming, and we don't have enough cross-disciplinary discussion and sharing of information. This is a great opportunity to share the same tools, to talk about the same sort of problems, the same sort of challenges, as well as the same kind of solutions. And so that was our lessons learned, and it's something that we're going to continue to explore going in the future. Now, as we were talking about sharing this information with this today, I went back a week or so ago and just kind of checked in on if it has anything changed. And so we have a little bit of an update. So the bad news is that email inbox that we created is still empty. We never heard from the vendor. They never responded. And that's, I guess, okay, because we did actually share that report with them. But they also never bothered to update their PGP key. So it makes me wonder as to whether or not they're even checking that inbox. Now, the good news is when we rerun the scan, the specific vulnerability that we alerted them to when with the business provided them with that report finally got fixed. So that's great. Unfortunately, it was the only one. And it does make me wonder whether or not this particular vendor is scanning their code and responding to what they find. I think that's going to be a topic the next time we assess them. And so I'm hoping that this gives folks something to build on, to bring all of those information security disciplines together, to encourage you to share ideas, share tools, share the issues and the concerns and the solutions. But most importantly, to share what you learn with the broader community, like events like we're doing right now. Keep learning, keep improving. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much for that, Michael. I was just, you said on your last slide what I was going to say when we got to the end. I really appreciate your sharing with us the innovative thought your team had about how to approach at least some vendor assessment problems. I've lived some of that pain with you on both sides of it, both answering questionnaires for people and evaluating others. And it's hard to figure out how much information you're getting that's actually useful. And as you went through your talk here, I thought to myself, I'd love to see more talks like this. I would love to hear more about how people are trying to solve problems in their business, whether it worked or not. And this did produce good results. Whether it solves all the problems or not, well, you said this solves some. You wouldn't recommend doing it everywhere. It's really useful to hear new ways to approach problems. And I think you're exactly right. These conferences should be a venue for trading practices like that.
Right. Well, and I think, Brian, there's a lot of follow-up to do, right? And we really do want to go back and say, how do we encourage this vendor to fix this? Do we have the right contract language in place to help them be successful? Because at the end of the day, it's not about pointing fingers. I don't want an adversarial relationship, which is why I went to some effort to anonymize them a bit. We want them to be successful because when they're successful, so are we. That's the point of having the vendors to begin with. So it's important to create a relationship where we're sharing that information and we're getting better. There's a question in chat there about the how often we assess the vendors. Great question. So we have a standard that we do, and it's based on kind of the industry norms. And I think it's something worth, kind of questioning. We don't assess vendors on the same cadence. We do it by risk level. If it's a higher risk level, we assess them more often on, at least an annual basis. Someone who does not necessarily touch our data or our systems perhaps could be assessed on a less often. But the point is really, how do we enrich the approach and the methodology around that? And I think the community as a whole has a lot of opportunity to really work together to find those solutions. I think the keynote this morning kind of emphasized that, we've got some work to do, and looking for new, unique ways to look at where those gaps are in the supply chain is going to become increasingly important.
We also have a question from Sam Harwin about what GRC tool you leverage, if you are willing to share that.
So I've worked in a few different shops. We've gone through a few tools. The current one is, everybody's, kind of made a shift to ServiceNow. But it which tool you use is not nearly as important as the process behind it. I'm a big advocate for that. Whether you're using RSA Archer or one of the other tools that have cropped up in the last couple of years, you know, you want to find something that's going to work best for you, and preferably something where you can do some integration as you have these tools that are going to be able to import that data and include it into, you know, your bigger reporting.
Sam also asks if you have found that particular questionnaire templates do a better job than others in hitting the sweet spot in due diligence.
You know, that's something I've been giving a lot of thought to lately. I have a lot of thoughts on that. I'm actually looking at trying to start some experiments around that very item. You know, I think the industry leader in that space is Shared Assessments with the SIG Lite, and they have they put together a very comprehensive survey, and they ask some really great questions. And I'm not here to say anything negative about Shared Assessments, but you know, there's challenges in that as well. The surveys are very long, and I find sometimes that when they update that survey year over year, they're not necessarily upgradable or backward compatible. And especially, you know, I had a survey just the other day that came in, and it was a SIG Lite, and I was like, hey, great, this might save me some time. I could probably use one of the ones I already have. The reason why I have multiple is because they're different versions. Well, this particular vendor was still using the survey from 2016, and I hadn't had one that had gone back that far. And they weren't interested in a newer one because they were looking to import it into their system. And that takes work to reconfigure the GRC tool because, you know, the survey is too specific as far as that mapping. And, you know, I've also done SIG fulls that were like 1,400 questions. And, you know, I do wonder about, did I answer all of those questions correctly? Not because I'm trying to mislead them. I want exactly the opposite. I want to provide accurate and assuring information. But my goodness, that's a lot of questions. I doubt myself, even if I have the best intentions.
Sam recommends we look at something called MVSP. It might be worth pursuing.
Okay, great. I think that's fabulous. I will definitely do that.
Yeah. One thing I liked in your story, you called it out, is that you involved your AppSec team because you had a particular approach that required some of their expertise in figuring out how to make the report you wanted to the vendor you were assessing. I wonder, just out of curiosity, are there other times and other reasons where you find to engage your AppSec team in your vendor assessment practices?
You know, we haven't yet. And I think this is, I'm hoping, my desire is this is really going to be the start of a much bigger endeavor, right? Like I said, often, and I've seen this in several shops, is even just within in the security space, the disciplinary silos kind of come up, and I like to try and break those down and get people talking about these things across discipline. You know, and the app space is a you know, and looking at the vendors and what they're doing, a lot of times those third-party analysts haven't necessarily had all of that exposure, and they need to learn and bring that expertise in. So I'm really encouraged, and I'm optimistic that this is a start of doing exactly that. I think there's long-term benefit.
The company, I think it might be situational to some degree. The company where I most recently worked, the AppSec team did contribute to vendor assessments, but only when the vendor was going to be integrated with platform.
Right.
Pretty easy to imagine. Yeah, we do need some assessment there. Yeah. Any other questions from the audience? that might be it. Well, thank you very much, Michael. That was informative, useful, and as I said, I'm really grateful to hear anybody talk about what they're trying out in the world to try and make our lives better, to get different and better and more meaningful results from our security work. With that, I will bring this session to a close. I'll put up our sponsor slide, and we'll have a 15-minute break before the next talk show starts at 1:30. And that'll be a keynote from Chitra, and I'm looking forward to that. I hope to see you all there then.
Sounds great. Thanks much, Brian.
Thank you, Michael. Bye.